Welcome to Talk 31 in our series where I'm reflecting on God's goodness to me throughout my life. In this talk I shall begin to talk about our life and ministry after we left Mattersey. I'll explain why I decided to retire from Mattersey when I did and why we moved to Devon. I'll describe my continuing involvement with Mattersey for a further 12 years and conclude by outlining our wider ministry in Europe. So, why I decided to retire when I did. In 2004, both Eileen and I had reached the age of 65. As was customary for women at that time, Eileen had retired as matron of the college 5 years previously, and I had told the Lord that unless he clearly showed me that I was to stay on, I would retire as principal when I was 65. First and foremost, we both wanted only to do what the Lord wanted, and as we prayed about it, became convinced that the time was right for our departure. Our decision was based on several facts. The Lord hadn't given us any indication that I should stay on, and he had clearly shown me that the man who would be appointed as my successor would be the man of his choosing. And as I mentioned in an earlier talk, I'd already discussed the matter with other leaders who had agreed with me that the timing was right. It was not as if my relationship with Mattersey was at an end. I was not retiring from Mattersey, I was retiring as its principal. Increasing requests for my ministry overseas had meant that a decision had to be made. I couldn't do justice to my role as principal and accept so many invitations to minister elsewhere. But that did not mean that I could not continue to teach in the college as a visiting lecturer, and at the kind invitation of successive principals, I continued to do so for another 12 years. Why we moved to Devon? Of course, we'd always known that we would have to move because the house we were living in belonged to the college and would be needed by my successor. And we knew that we would have to move immediately. That's why we were considering our options 2 or 3 years beforehand. Colin Whittaker had written to me encouraging me to move right away from Mattersey, and Eileen and I both felt that this would be wise. For one thing, the new principal would almost certainly want to make some changes, and it would be easier both for him and for us if we were not living close by and being asked by our friends in the local church if we approved. Apart from that, our first consideration, wherever we moved, was to be sure that there was a good local AOG church within easy reach where we could become members. Of course, there were plenty of places like that all over the country, so why did we choose Devon? One option might be to move near to one of our children, but as they were all serving the Lord in different parts of the country and might move on at any time, that might not be the wisest course of action. So we felt it would be better, both for them and for us, if we were to move to a part of the country where the grandchildren would enjoy coming for their holidays. And we could think of no better place than Devon. I'd been there on holiday as a teenager, and it was there that I'd felt God calling me to the ministry. We knew that there were 3 AOG churches in Torbay, one in Torquay, one in Paynton, and one in Brixham, where Bob Hyde, one of our former students, was the full-time pastor and leader of the ministry team. Bob had invited me down to minister on at least 2 occasions, and we were very happy with the way the church was structured and with the spiritual atmosphere in the meetings. Neither of the other churches had invited us to minister, and so we knew very little about them. So we started to seriously consider fellowshipping with the Brixham Assembly if we were able to afford to move into the Torbay area. I phoned Bob and asked if he would be happy about this, explaining that I was not looking for any position in the local church and that my ministry would be further afield. For 2 or 3 years we've been looking at property prices in the area, and as it was not convenient to make regular 600-mile round trips to view properties as they came on the market, decided on a new property that was to be built in Paynton. We were able to view one just like it and choose a plot where another was to be built. A 4-bedroomed house with spectacular views over open countryside and the sea, the nearest beach being only a 10-minute drive away. We decided very quickly that this would be the house for us, and because of God's wonderful provision, were able to buy it in 2003 and move in immediately after we retired from Mattersey in July 2004. We spent 10 very happy years there until we felt the Lord prompting us to move into Brixham to be nearer to the church in 2013, more of which later. Meanwhile, I continued to teach at Mattersey and expand our travelling ministry overseas. It was always a great joy to revisit Mattersey each year to teach various MTH courses specialising on the baptism in the Holy Spirit, spiritual gifts and divine healing. Each time we stayed with our friends William and Anthea Kay, who were still living close to Mattersey, and enjoyed renewed fellowship with them. It was on one such occasion in September 2005 that Eileen was involved in a serious accident. I was teaching a combined class of students in the college chapel when I was surprised to see Dr. Dave Allen come in at the back. He walked quietly forward and approached me on the platform. Then he whispered to me, "You need to go. Eileen is all right, but she's been involved in an accident. I'll take over here. They'll tell you more in the office." The accident had happened less than a mile outside Mattersey on the Retford Road. Someone, I don't remember who, drove me there immediately, and the first thing I saw was a fire engine and an ambulance. I was so glad that Dave Allen had already told me that Eileen was all right, or I would almost certainly have feared the worst. I later discovered a voicemail message on my phone, which had been switched onto silent while I was lecturing. It was Eileen saying, "David, I've been in an accident. You need to come. I can't breathe." And her voice petered out. Oh, I'm so grateful that I didn't receive that message until after I knew she was all right. It was the airbag that had saved her, but the pressure of it was causing the difficulty in her breathing. The accident wasn't Eileen's fault. She was driving into Retford to do some shopping when another car coming in the opposite direction overtook a cyclist on a blind bend and crashed head-on into Eileen. As both cars were probably travelling at about 50 miles an hour, the full force of the impact would have been about 100 miles an hour. Both cars were a write-off. The other driver was told that she would probably never walk again as a result of the injuries she suffered. Eileen escaped with 2 cracked ribs, from which she recovered relatively quickly. Our insurance company provided a courtesy car for us, and a few days later we drove home to Devon after I finished the series of lectures I'd been giving. Fortunately, we had enough money to buy a replacement vehicle without waiting for the insurance settlement to come through, as less than a week later I was committed to teach an MA course at the Continental Theological Seminary in Brussels. We were both so grateful for the loving care of Trude and Sylve. Trude is Bob Hyde's wife, twin sisters from our church in Brixham, who looked after Eileen during my absence. I've always been amazed at Eileen's patience and fortitude in situations like this, and the courage she displayed in face of adversity. I've already mentioned this when speaking about the accident which prevented her from travelling with me to Burkina Faso. But these qualities became even more evident in later life, about which I will say more in a later talk. And now, our wider ministry. Apart from my continuing input at Mattersey, in the years that followed our departure to Devon in 2004, much of my ministry involved teaching in Bible colleges and speaking at national conferences overseas. Invitations came from former students and because of contacts through EPTA, PEF and the PWF. Eileen was usually able to travel with me, and between 2005 and 2012 I ministered in churches, colleges and conferences in Belgium, Ethiopia, Finland, France, Germany, Ghana, India, Ireland, Luxembourg, Madeira, Netherlands, Nigeria, Poland, Portugal, Reunion, Slovakia, South Africa, Sweden and Ukraine. In this talk, we'll just be referring to countries in Europe. Some of these places I visited only once, while others, like Finland and Belgium, were countries where I taught in their Bible colleges annually. The subject was almost invariably connected with the work of the Holy Spirit, his person and work, the baptism in the Spirit, spiritual gifts and healing. Of particular importance was the time I spent with pastors and national leaders, sharing with them on how to encourage spiritual gifts in the local church. Places I visited only once during these years were Sweden in 2005, Ukraine in 2006, and Poland in 2007, and Slovakia in 2008. Eileen accompanied me on the trips to Sweden for a week's teaching in Kristinehamn and Slovakia for an EPTA conference in the vicinity of Bratislava. I travelled unaccompanied to Poland to teach for a week in the Warsaw Theological Seminary and preach in the local Pentecostal church. But when I visited Ukraine, I was part of a 3-man team from our church in Brixham. As it was my first and only visit, Bob Hyde and Mark Goodyear, both of whom had been before, let me do most of the teaching. In all the churches we visited, the subject they asked me to speak on was spiritual gifts. There, as is sadly the case in so many places elsewhere, there's very little teaching on this important subject. So when the opportunity was given in each church, at the end of the meeting, people flocked forward for prayer. Visits I made to Ireland in 2006, 2007 and 2008 were mainly in connection with my new role as a member of the Board of Governors of the Irish AOG Bible College in Greystones, a seaside village a few miles south of Dublin, where Daniel Caldwell, a former Mattersey student, was now the principal, and where several other Mattersey graduates like Roy Leith and Sandy Tutty were now involved. I also had the privilege of preaching at their graduation service in September 2007. Eileen and I had often visited our friends John and Anne Leese in Luxembourg as we were en route for our holidays in France or Germany, and were always grateful for their hospitality. And in 2006, I was asked to be the guest speaker at their church's weekend retreat held in Arlon in nearby Belgium. It was always a joy to renew fellowship with our friends from that wonderful church. I also preached there in September 2012 after teaching at CTS in Brussels and before driving on for a week's teaching in churches in the Paris area of France. Over a period of about 20 years, I should say, we regularly went to France for our holidays, and I would often end up preaching in one of the AOG churches there. I don't have detailed dates for these occasions, but I remember preaching in Auch, Bordeaux, Clermont-Ferrand, Metz, Murex, Toulouse and Versailles, sometimes with less than 24 hours' notice. But perhaps the most interesting part of France we've ever visited was the Île de la Réunion, to which I will return next time. The countries I visited most frequently were Germany 3 times, Portugal 4 times, Belgium 8 times, and Finland 11 times. With the exception of Germany, this was because I was annually teaching in their Bible colleges. Having said that, In 2009, I did teach for a week at Cnebis in the Black Forest at the European Theological Seminary, a beautiful college belonging to the Church of God, where the EPTA conference was to be held the following week. And in 2007, after attending a PEF-related conference in Oslo, Norway, we flew to Germany to conduct seminars at the National Pastors' Conference of the BFP, the nearest equivalent to the AOG in Germany. It was also in Oslo that I bumped into Werner Fraß, the president of the Volksmission group of German churches, and was invited to conduct a tour of their churches in southern Germany in 2008. Eileen always remembered this well, as we slept in at least 10 different beds during the course of 2 weeks' ministry there before driving on to the EPTA conference in Slovakia. I first visited Portugal in 1982 for an EPTA conference, but it was many years later that I had the opportunity to teach in their Bible college and preach in their churches. Harry Osland was an American missionary who, at the time, was director of the Portuguese Bible College in Fanois, near Lisbon. It so happened that in 2006, he was in an MA class I was teaching in Belgium at the Continental Theological Seminary, and he asked me if I'd be willing to come and teach in Portugal. So, for 3 years, 07, 08 and 09, I spent a week or so in Portugal, teaching in their college and preaching in their churches. Harry not only organised the itinerary for me, but also arranged for several of my books to be translated into Portuguese. He and his wife Beth became good friends, and Eileen and I really appreciated their kindness and hospitality. Another contact I had with Portugal was Reginaldo Azevedo de Melo, a Brazilian brother based in Portugal who came to Mattersey as one of our students. With the cooperation of Pastor Luis Reis, who knew me through PEF, after he graduated, Reginaldo arranged an itinerary for me, preaching in several churches there. Our trips to Portugal gave us a taste for Portuguese cuisine, something we also experienced in Madeira, a Portuguese overseas territory and popular holiday destination because of its pleasant climate all the year round. We first went there in 2008, courtesy of our friends William and Anthea Kay, who let us use their lovely timeshare apartment. This inspired us to get our own timeshare, and we returned for 3 weeks in 2010, when I was asked to preach in the small AOG church in Funchal, about which I shall say more in a later talk. My ministry in Belgium was due first to my work in the International Correspondence Institute, which I referred to in an earlier talk, and secondly to my contact with CTS, the Continental Theological Seminary, through fellowship with friends in EPTA. Roland and Judy Dudley, American Assemblies of God missionaries, had led the Portuguese Bible College back in the 80s and had moved on to St. Peter's Lieu in near Brussels to head up CTS. At Roland's invitation, I taught on the baptism in the Holy Spirit, spiritual gifts and divine healing on their MA program for 8 consecutive years, 2005 to 2012. I was often asked to preach on their chapel services, when we saw many students receive the baptism in the Holy Spirit. Eileen and I were housed in one of the well-equipped apartments in the college. We always enjoyed our visits to Belgium and took the opportunity to admire the wonderful architecture in cities like Brussels and Ghent, as well as preaching in churches there. And every year we were at CTS, we made sure that we made a visit to the outlet store of a nearby chocolate factory and bring back plenty in time for Christmas. And finally, Finland, a country we visited even more often than Belgium. Apart from my contact with Tervo Valkema that I mentioned in an earlier talk, it was friends I met at PEF and EPTA meetings who were the main instigators of our visits to that beautiful country. I first met Arto Hämäläinen at the ICO conference in Brighton in June 1991, which I think I mentioned in an earlier talk, but later got to know him much better as we both served on the PEF Presidium, he as secretary and I as vice chairman. Arto was the missions director for the Finnish Pentecostal churches and was responsible for the recommending me for my first visit to Ethiopia in 2005 and my visit to India in 2010, about which I will say more next time. But it was Pasi Parkkila, the director of the Finnish Bible College, who was responsible for most of our visits to Finland. I first met Pasi at an EPTA conference, I don't remember which, possibly at CTS in 02 or in Nantwich in 04, but he asked me if I would be willing to teach on their MA programme at Isakiria, which incidentally means the Great Book. What a name for a Bible college. So, apart from 2010, when I was too unwell to go, I taught at Isakiria the same subjects as I was teaching at CTS every year from 2005 to 2012. But apart from teaching at Isakiria, I also visited Finland for the EPTA conference in 06 and was the guest speaker at their National Pastors Conference, both in 08 and 09. Eileen invariably travelled with me on our visits to Isakiria, when most years we were accommodated in a comfortable log cabin overlooking a beautiful lake. Tula, Pasi's wife, a primary school teacher, kindly loaned us her car throughout our visits, which gave us a measure of independence while we were there, enabling us to drive into the nearest town, Keulu, or to Jyväskylä, a larger town a little further away. We were also able to visit a number of churches during our trips, including one at Seinäjoki, where outstanding miracles of healing were regularly taking place in their meetings. From the reports I was hearing, I could hardly imagine that there was anyone in the church left with a problem. But after my preaching, some 50 or 60 people came forward for prayer, all expecting to be personally prayed for. And as we had to communicate through an interpreter, this inevitably took twice as long as usual. An hour and a half after the end of the meeting, I laid hands on the last person and was feeling in need of prayer myself. I was extremely tired and hungry, but felt I'd learnt a lesson. Even when miracles are happening, there will always be people in need of prayer. Perhaps the final thing to say about Finland is that at the request of Aikamedia, the Finnish publishing department, at least 4 of my books have been published in Finnish. I am encouraged that my teaching in Finland still goes on, though I have not been there in person since 2012. The Lord has certainly extended the scope of my ministry and confirmed that it was right for us to leave Mattersey when we did. Next time, we'll talk about our trips to Reunion, Africa, and India. Till then, the Lord bless you.